Bom dia, gente. Vamos seguir. Tá? É um prazer apresentar a nossa próxima palestrante. Eu vou fazer a introdução em português. Tá? A Mari é professora, a doutora Mari Castañeda é professora da Universidade de Massachusetts. Ela é doutora em filosofia pela Universidade da Califórnia, em São Diego. Ela foi, durante muito tempo, coordenadora de um programa de igualdade de gênero dentro da Faculdade de Ciências lá. E ela é autora de um dos livros, que foi a maneira que nós conhecemos ela, chamado, o livro titulado Mothers in Academia, As Mães na Academia. E ela é, agora, atualmente, a diretora do Centro para Estudos Latino-Americanos, Caribenhos e envolvidas em estudos em relação de mulheres, gêneros, sexualidade. E ela atua ativamente nos tópicos que a gente vem discutindo ao longo desses dias. So, Mary, it's a really big pleasure to have you here today. She'll be speaking in English, and then we can, during the questions, if someone needs any help, we can try to translate it and then communicate. Okay? Thank you, Mary.
Gracias, Fernanda. ¿Está trabajando esto? Sí. ¿Me pueden oír bien? Okay. So I thank you, Fernanda, for inviting me to be here. I wish that I could do the talk in Portuguese, but I'm going to have to do it in English. I do speak Español, so afterwards, if folks would rather ask a question in Spanish, that's completely fine as well. But my, Spanish is a very California Chicana Spanish as well, so that's a whole other ball game. But I wanted to make sure that folks, understood the talk that I have here today, and I'm very honored and very excited to be part of the symposium. So far, all the conversations that have been happening, not only in the discussions here, but actually in those moments of coffee and traveling from the hotel to here have been really wonderful and generative, and have also inspired me to think about my own work and the future work that I'm conducting. So thank you, Fernanda, again for inviting me, and for all of you for being here this morning. I also want to give praise to the ancestors who it wouldn't be possible for me to be here if it wasn't for the labor and their backs in terms of their own lives. So I wanted to make sure to acknowledge that. I also want to dedicate this talk. Thank you. I also want to dedicate this talk to my dear amiga and collaborator, sister mama scholar Kirsten Isgro. She's an amazing professor that I've been collaborating with in the United States for basically almost a decade. And during that time, she had twin daughters, one of them of which was born with a terminal disease. And so she's been someone that I've been working with really carefully, and for me really embodies this notion of a poetics of a mama scholar, with her perseverance and love and care and brilliant grace and community building that is necessary for juggling the multiple positionalities of motherhood and academia. And here I just wanted to show two of the pieces that we've worked on. The first one is the book that was published through Columbia University Press. And the second one is an article that came out in the Women's Studies International Forum on Mothers in the U.S. Academy, Insights of Lived Experience. And this notion of lived experience is something that I'll also be talking about today, particularly through the concept of testimonio. So my talk today will center the experiences of mama scholars and how the poetics of their counter-narratives can serve as a reference point for why cultural and policy shifts are important within higher education. And I really will be focusing more on the academy and higher education per se. But we'll also discuss, and hopefully we can have a conversation afterwards, about how institutions, how research institutions can foster what we call a culture of care, and then develop equitable policies for parents and mothers and really caretakers within the academy overall, which so many of us are involved in. But first, let me say this. Unsure of what the balance held, I touched my belly overwhelmed by what I had been chosen to perform. But then an angel came one day told me to kneel down and pray, for unto me a man-child would be born. Woe, this crazy circumstance, I knew his life deserved a chance, but everybody told me to be smart. Look at your career, they said. Lauren, baby, use your head. But instead, I chose to use my heart. These lines are actually from a hip-hop artist named Lauryn Hill. I'm a kid of the 80s, so I do love hip-hop. And Lauryn Hill, in particular, her song Zion was playing a lot at the time when I was 27 years old, and I was writing my dissertation while also juggling the parenting of a 3-year-old son. There were multiple people in my life, especially professors at my university, who were agitated, upset, that I was not thinking about my career first. How dare I get pregnant if I was also attempting to become a scholar, a researcher, a social scientist, an intellectual in the academy? These two realities, motherhood and a scholarly career, especially when you were starting out as a graduate student or a new professor in the field, were perceived to not mesh, to not align, to not fit each other's landscapes or worldviews. If anything, these lyrics point to any woman wishing to have a career, oftentimes is asked to put it first, as opposed to having any kind of thoughts of holding a child in your arm, whether you're birthing a child or adopting one. And this notion that you can't have both becomes very difficult. My son, Miguel, is now a 22-year-old graduate student at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And I don't regret the juggle, the struggle, the lopsided balancing act I was doing every single day. His presence in my life gave it meaning, wholeness, a deep root from which I could produce my scholarly work and perform a radical love that persisted and insisted on an embodiment of Mama Scholar Poetics. And this is not to say that if you don't have children, you don't have that same meaning that's produced. But in my particular life, in my particular context, because I was having a child at the age of 23 years old, that little boy became the motivation and the inspiration that I needed to finish the dissertation on time and then become a professor. And I've been at the University of Massachusetts now for 18 years as a faculty member. So just really quickly, the picture at the very top was when I was writing my dissertation, and he was 3 years old. So there were many times where I was writing, and I'm sure probably many of you have had that same experience when the kids are sitting on your lap while you're also attempting to write, and they're also trying to write with you, or they're just hugging you. And that particular picture, he was very upset because my mom was trying to pull him off my lap and was saying, "Mijo, no, tu mamá tiene que trabajar, ándale, vámonos para acá, let's go somewhere else." And he insisted on staying there and just sort of sat in my lap while I was writing. So for me, that dissertation was also this embodiment of this radical love that I was trying to practice. The second picture at the bottom is when I defended my dissertation, and then Miguel had just turned 5 years old, and so he was about to begin kindergarten in Massachusetts, and I was going to begin as a new assistant professor at the university. And so we were both starting off these lives together. And then the last picture here was taken about 2 months ago when I went with him to South Africa because I was giving a talk at the University of Cape Town, and he was also starting as a new graduate student, so we aligned the trips so we can go together. And as you can see, I'm very sad. He's of course very happy and was like, "Bye, see you later." And I was like, "No." So, and it's really, and of course he went away to college, but there was something about him now really launching off into his own life, into his own scholarly career, because now he is becoming a graduate student and wanting to do his own research and engagement and so forth. And so that became one of the last pictures that actually was the last picture we took together before I came back to the United States. And so I wanted to just sort of show that sort of context in terms of where I situate myself and I'm coming from in terms of my own experience and embodiment of parenthood and motherhood in particular. And so again, this notion that everybody told me to be smart, look at your career, they said, Mari, baby, use your head. But instead I chose to use my heart. And that heart wasn't this notion that I could do one or the other, but in fact, the heart that I could do both, and felt that I could both have a scholarly career that was engaging, rigorous, difficult, that was really, in many ways, helping me to think about the kind of work I wanted to do and the contributions I wanted to make to the academic landscape, and at the same time wanting to be a mother and being a mother, and what does that mean, and sort of balancing and juggling that. That also doesn't mean that there weren't many times he was not by himself, obviously, but where I was not with him 24/7. I did rely ultimately on a partner, on a community of other members where I live that were helping me and really sort of embodying that notion of a village of helping take care and raise him, including my family in California. So what does this mean, this poetics of a mama scholar? It means, borrowing from Gloria Anzaldúa, that theory of the flesh, that the creation of theorizing through our lived experiences, the complexity of what it means to be a mother in the academy, has the ability to embody these multiple intersectional identities and inform our parenting and scholarship. It means having communion with others that often leads to new understanding and collective knowledge building that helps foster a culture of care that hopefully embodies a radical love. It means developing a theoretical and empirical structure of feeling and ways of life that is rooted in the rhythmic movement of social justice and the transcultural complexity of how caretaking, not just mothering and not just parenting, but caretaking in the sort of broadest sense, and research endeavors have awkward yet productive encounters as they intersect, tug and pull and enrich one another. Despite the social cultural possibilities of mama scholars, it's important to be real about the realities of mothers in academia, and I think yesterday and today we've been seeing multiple examples from the presentations that are still pointing to what are those structural realities and what are the ways in which folks are still within academic context, still experiencing perhaps bias or discrimination, for instance, by being not just a woman, but also a mother in this context. Internationally, the number of women that are actually mothers is right now, and these numbers are not so great, but they're about 15%. But of course, many of these women also are not permanent faculty, but contingent, part-time lecturers oftentimes. And in fact, the number of permanent tenure-track mama scholars is much lower. Ironically, many academic institutions around the globe are largely staffed by women. And so we have to really ask ourselves, who sustains the world of academia? Who are the people that are really sort of making it run? I know that at my institution, and currently I'm the chair of my department, out of the majority of 10 staff members, only 2 are men and the other 8 are women. And they're women that are working as bookkeepers, secretaries, other folks on campuses that are working as custodians, cooks, accountants, lab coordinators. And if we really look around our campus, we actually see many, many women that are in those particular spaces. And the other thing I wanted to note that, again, thinking about how did the staffing take place. In my co-edited book, Mothers in Academia, we made an effort to broaden the definition of academic mothers to acknowledge more than just professors, but also honor the labor of many mothers who are working, supporting, moving forward the academic enterprise of higher education. This means a broader range of academic mothers needs to be recognized, and in so doing, mama scholars can build solidarity across ranks and employment positions. In the book, we had an author by the name of Wendy Wild who discussed her experience as a mother working as a staff member, as a secretary in the university, and the importance of her alliance with mama scholars in her department, not only because they encouraged her to continue her education, but also provided much needed emotional support and advocacy when she was juggling her work with her motherhood responsibilities. So it's important for all, I think that as we speak about mothers in academia and parents in academia, to think about how do we build solidarity with the other mothers that we're working with side by side in these academic and research institutions, so that it doesn't become just simply about the professors, but really the larger, broader landscape in which we are working and also teaching and conducting research. And specifically, because many of these women are also the ones that are supporting our research endeavors. I know that I rely on our accountant for the grants that I receive to be able to help me at the same time while I know that she's juggling 2 twin boys that are teenagers. And so being sort of cognizant of aware of people's lived experiences becomes an important way of thinking, how do we create a culture of care in these spaces, so that as a chair of the department, when she has a challenge where she has to get home, I can take that into account as part of creating an environment that's inclusive and that really takes that into account and doesn't penalize her for being a mother in that particular academic context. But that is also part of the reality that I think we're also dealing with in terms of women, particularly mothers, being penalized in these academic spaces. I have a colleague by the name of Joya Misra, who in a recently published article in Working Woman was quoted as saying that she tells her graduate students not to reveal their parental status when they're on job interviews for professor positions. And partly it's because of what's called the motherhood penalty that actually is imposed upon all women who are mothers. And I want to talk a little bit of what is that motherhood penalty that takes place. Part of it has to do that the cost, including mama scholars, pay for having children. And so this particular study actually looked, and it was a study that was also in many ways also done with researchers in France, that looked at the way in which the widening salary divide was a very real thing that was impacting mothers over time. So the other thing is that it's affecting the wage gap, but also the advancement of in the workforce. And this particular research was also done by the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. And so one of the things that Joya was finding was that, she states, whether you have 1 or 2 children doesn't really matter to an employer. Just the fact you're a mother is powerful enough to impact your advancement in the workforce financially and status-wise. And so this research was really trying to demonstrate by looking at the data of how mothers really are particularly being impacted as they enter into the workforce, whether it's in an academic context or not. And so she's been grappling herself, and how do we change that? How do we sort of try to address those particular issues? And I wanted to show here what exactly is that penalty that has been experienced, and the study was from 1986 to 2014. And again, a big part of it is trying to really be clear about what is happening, how do we make it visible, and how do we change it? Because continuing this particular motherhood penalty is unacceptable. It is unacceptable in the ways in which it's affecting women's wages over the long haul of their careers, but also the legacy of wealth that gets impacted as a result of that impact of the wage gap that affects their children as well in the future. And so they found, both Joya Misra and colleagues in France at the university there, they found that women with mothers with 3 or more children made 18% less than childless women, even when controlling for education and for experience. So that was the key thing, that they were really controlling for education and experience, and still found a significant gap if you had 3 children or more. If you have 2 children, the gap was 13%. And the other piece that now they're really trying to figure out, why is this the case? Even women with 1 child were impacted by the wage gap. And the thing that's interesting about what's happened in basically these last 30 years is that women with 1 child, the gap grew from 8% to 14%. So then you would expect that if you had 1 child, you might not be impacted as much. But in fact, what they found was that the gap has even grown even more, which ultimately the argument was that it doesn't matter whether you have 3, 2, or 1, women that had children were still being impacted and penalized salary-wise, advancement-wise, in the workforce overall, but including the academic workforce as well. And so currently there's a group of us that are trying to really think about and unpack what does that mean, particularly in an academic context, because I think many universities and research institutions pride themselves on being equitable, pride themselves in saying we treat men and women and transgender folks equally. But we're finding that that's not the case. And we know that that's not the case. We've experienced it ourselves. We've witnessed it with other people. And the other piece is trying to think about how do women, as they move through the ranks, become chairs of departments, presidents of universities, deans of institutions, take this knowledge into account as they're negotiating salaries with faculty, or as they take it into account as they're trying to create more equitable in a culture of care context. And so this is an important part of trying to make that very clear. So part of it is, again, looking at the actual data of salaries and the wage gap and so forth. But the other piece that many of us are also becoming more interested in and really trying to think about how do we also do it in a way that is also qualitative, that takes into account lived experiences, is that one of the ways of making this unfair treatment visible, and part of it, again, had to do with the book that I published along with several articles, has to do with believing that testimonio, that the autohistoria, the self-representation of our lived experiences can be a critical tool for making the multiple and complex realities of motherhood in academia visible and transformative for ourselves and for our institutions. It is through this process of documentation that we bear witness to the juggling we perform while parenting and studying and researching and theorizing within our fields. According to the Feminista Latina group in the US, testimonio is a powerful tool because it's a research method and political praxis in which it positions mujeres and underrepresented groups as central to the analysis and reassigns agency. Additionally, it acknowledges, as Alacron and other authors have noted, quote, "The personal is indeed political, as we acknowledge our collective memories, our shared histories. Through testimonio, we acknowledge our own resiliency and the histories of our resistance. Telling our personal histories and testimonios as mama scholars in the academy becomes nothing less than transformational. Our use of testimonio narrative reflects the praxis grounded in the community work and activist scholarship that we engage with as we negotiate the academy as mama scholars. To read and to listen to each other's stories is to commit to another kind of understanding, a solidarity of the challenges of motherhood, parenthood, caretaking, and academic labor, and as it intersects with gender and race, and the violence of patriarchy, the experiences of being treated as an alien oftentimes in one's own country or research institution. A few years ago, Chicana Mother Work, which is a group also in the US that has been trying to really note and voice their support within the broader academic landscape, has been producing thought-provoking digital scholarship that is generating not only dialogues, but also creating stories and narratives that are accessible outside of traditional venues of publication in order to really start a scholarly conversation and continue one that's already been ongoing about what it means to be in these academic institutions as a parent, particularly as we deal with questions of race, of gender, of sexual orientation, of class, that many of us oftentimes sort of take for granted, but in fact very much inform the ways in which we're perceived within academic context and the way that we experience what does it mean to be a professor and a researcher in the scholars in these spaces. For instance, as someone myself who is the first person in my family to go to college, my parents didn't go to college, so I was the first one to not only go as an undergraduate, but eventually as a PhD, and also now as a professor. And not only that, but then so the class positionality that I'm sort of coming from, but in the United States, also as a Latina. And what does that mean in those contexts where oftentimes there's perceptions about the inability or the questioning about my intelligence, about my ability to belong in these spaces, the ability to also conduct research or have authority. And I have to say, since becoming chair of the department, it's been really wonderful to challenge those perceptions that happen, not only that, that I'm a first generation, which is what we call in the United States as a first person going to college, first generation Latina with authority in a big academic department, and people encounter me and sort of being taken aback and will ask, where's the chair of the department? I'm like, I'm right here. And then folks being sort of taken aback, but then realizing, well, oh yeah, you know your stuff, you know what you're talking about. But also as a parent, and the fact that oftentimes that also takes people by surprise, that I had a child, I don't think 23 is young, but coming from the community I was coming from, but in academic spaces, that's oftentimes considered quite young, especially in graduate school. But then also having my son with me at many conferences, at research sites. He was someone that accompanied me, not every time, but in many spaces that disrupted what it meant to be an academic in the academy. But also the other thing that was important for me, because I was a first generation and trying to create a counter narrative of what it means to be a scholar, I also brought mi mamá and mis hermanas and mis hermanos to various different conferences as well. And so people would say, wow, Mari rolls deep. She brings everyone with her. Not that I can bring everyone with me all the time, but when it made sense, I was in Los Angeles to give a talk. I invited them all to come to my talk so that they could see what it is that I was doing, but so that their presence also disrupted what is the academy, that history of the academy, and how we can make it something different and reimagine it as something that also is inclusive to so many other different kinds of people. So that was an important part of that. And testimonio is one of those methodological and theoretical tools as an effort to try to do that, which we also call the politics of possibility, the politics of a possibility of a different kind of mundo that we can create, that we can co-create in these academic and research spaces by bringing our whole selves, to these places. And that I think in many ways, I feel that is changing my institution, my department, and the ways that folks come into that space, seeing me not only as chair, but also in the ways that I bring a different sort of understanding that is based on this first generation Latina sort of perspective that is very different, and from California, which is also very different from New England ways of being, that I think transforms it. And so I think questioning and thinking, how do we do that ourselves? How are we transforming our institutions and our departments by bringing our full selves into these spaces, these lived experiences that inform how we're doing our research, how we're teaching, how we're producing scholarship. I don't see them necessarily as these separate entities and practices and experiences, but in fact are very much informing one another, sometimes unconsciously, but very, very present. So that's an important way of sort of documenting and worthwhile how this endeavor can change the way in which we're treated in the world. Yet, at the same time, we still have to be real about the experiences of academic women overall, and of course mothers in particular. But the reality is that institutions of higher education around the globe are still not doing a great job of really sort of creating equitable spaces for women to become professors, researchers, deans, presidents, leaders in institutions. And so some of the studies that are out there, for instance, across the European Union, which actually includes quite a bit of countries, you still have 20% of women leading institutions, which in fact there are obviously many more women within that particular demographic. And the other, in Japan, for instance, 24% of women hold faculty positions. In the United States, actually what we call women of color, women that are Black, Latina, Asian American, and Native American, so anyone who is not sort of perceived as being white, that percentage is actually much lower. So you have only 8% of that particular demographic holding faculty, permanent faculty positions at universities across the United States in a country that is becoming what's called majority minority, in a country where you actually have many more people, particularly by 2050, that are going to be largely Latina, Latino, Latin American, plus Black, Asian American, and Native American. So there's a disconnect that's happening even at our own institutions in the United States, where we're not being cognizant of the fact that there is serious discrepancies and inequities that are still existing. The other piece of it is that there's still implicit bias, and there was earlier presentation was really speaking to that. There was another presentation that yesterday also spoke to that. That is actually very real. That is really impacting the ways in which women are perceived in these academic contexts. On top of that, the other positionality of being a mother. And so that does affect hiring, promotion, in addition to tenure at various institutions. I myself have witnessed the ways in which other faculty will talk about other women faculty, will talk about other women that have children and their ability or inability to be able to do the rigorous work that's necessary because of what they see as time. And so already before they even have a chance to show that they have the capacity to do their work, they're already being perceived as not being able to do it, and therefore don't get hired or don't get promoted. And my work, particularly as an administrator, have been working very hard to disrupt that, to really question, why do you think they don't fit in this space? You know, what is it specifically that you think is affecting their ability to get hired or be a faculty member here? And it's interesting how people are like, you know, they can't pinpoint it because it is this implicit bias that's taking place. And in pointing it out, people do back up and are say, okay, maybe you're right. Maybe I wasn't thinking about X, Y, Z. And so really calling it out and really sort of pointing to it becomes experience. The other issue is that we're still having many women, especially mothers, who are dropping out of the academic pipeline. Again, this was also presented today and yesterday as well as something that is affecting graduate school as well as faculty pipeline. And what does that do ultimately for women? In addition to these, again, low percentages and implicit bias, the other thing that really affects it is, you know, really questioning why it's difficult for academia to embrace the joyful laughter of children, the celestial elegance of pregnant bodies, the sublime aura of nursing mothers. It is not fair that we often feel that we must choose one or the other, to be a researcher or a mother, as if these things are completely incompatible, which they are not. And Dr. Marianne Mason, who also has a rich body of work that looks at particularly women in academia, not just mothers, but particularly the way in which mothers oftentimes, when they're forced to have to leave the academic landscape, are experiencing feelings of sadness and anger. We're perplexed and sometimes even ashamed of not being able to do it all. And we feel that way because, again, of those Hollywood and I think oftentimes media narratives and also cultural narratives that we're supposed to be these superwomen that are able to do it all and not get the help and support that we need from our communities, our partners, our families, which in fact makes a big difference in our ability to be able to do all these pieces. Maybe we don't do it all at the same time, but we do it at different points in time in our careers and in our lives. And I think seeing those ebbs and flows is important. And yet, it is not our fault. The structures that have created academia, patriarchy, classism, racism, sexism, to name a few, often make it difficult to succeed. And yet, if we do succeed, sometimes it is at the cost of our health, our marriages, our partnerships, our children's well-being. And this is a real piece of experience that we have. Dr. Whitney Priddle, she's an assistant professor who recently published an essay that's called Motherhood While Black, The Hard Truth About Race and Parenthood, because again, this is a very real thing in the United States. She notes, the year after my son was born, in the third year of my PhD program, I found myself isolated, overwhelmed, overlooked. I was replaced on projects I had previously worked on, and I wasn't invited to join others. I couldn't afford the money and the time needed to travel to other conferences. I didn't even take time off, enrolled my son in daycare, and spent most days on campus working to meet deadlines. I was told I was not serious about my research. I was instructed to be more like the male graduate students, a cohort below me, who actually one of them had a wife who was taking care of a baby. An advice that actually erased the many statuses between us. One faculty member later revealed that he hadn't actively mentored me because he thought I was going to drop out and have more children. This is how intersectional subordination works. And this treatment wasn't just because I was a parent, but also because I was a young Black mother, and it was shaping the ways that people were perceiving and treating me. And so Whitney's story speaks to me directly because myself, as a 22-year-old parent, I experienced the exact same thing when a professor told me that I was, quote, damaged goods because I was pregnant as a doctoral student. And therefore, in the graduate program that I was in, as a graduate student commodity, I was not exactly going to yield any value according to them because I was now going to have a son. And therefore, why bother supporting and mentoring me? Luckily, not all the professors in my program felt I was impaired or tarnished, and the advisors actually that supported me dismissed the sexist anti-mother, and I really think it's really important to call it out as a sexist anti-mother because in my experience and what I've seen in some of the research as well, fathers do get treated differently and oftentimes do get the support that's necessary and many times often lauded for having a child or having children while in graduate school, but that's not always necessarily the case for women. And so I think that that's also an important thing to sort of note and document in those differences. And so I think that we can re-envision and reimagine how we treat mothers in the academy. And again, thinking about this politics of possibility and the culture of care at our institutions that challenge gatekeepers and their social relations with us. And again, studies show that when we focus on mothers, not only do mothers benefit, but there are ripple effects that benefit other populations on campus as well, fathers and other folks that actually are not parenting children, but have families with aging parents or have sick siblings or family members or friends. So just because you don't have children, it doesn't mean that folks are not caretaking and are not involved in the care of others. So how do we sort of take that broader context into account? For instance, also maternity leave is now called parental leave, and that benefits moms and dads alike. So what are some, to start, I don't know how much time I have left, but anyways, I want to make sure we're okay? Okay, absolutely. That's a perfect timing because I'm getting ready to conclude. But I did want to share what are some of the best practices that are currently sort of viewed as ways of supporting not just mothers, but parents as a whole in academic institutions. So for instance, what we are seeing at my university is that when a parent is going to have a child or adopt a child, they are granted full semester leave with pay. They have an automatic tenure and promotion clock extension, and they are not required to do service and outreach activities during the time that there are leave. And they are not penalized for doing for not doing research during that time. That is taken into account when they're going up for tenure and promotion. And this is very rare to have a full semester with leave in order to care for a child that you've either adopted or you're foster care or you've birthed yourself or that is being birthed in your family. Department chairs and deans can work closely and collaboratively with faculty members to discuss work schedules and service outreach aspiration before and after, for instance, the coming of a child in a family, or if there are caretaking needs that arise for someone that perhaps doesn't have a child, but has maybe a sick parent or has a sick partner that they have to take care of, which increasingly what we're seeing in the United States as our faculty population ages, that's one of the realities that a lot of my faculty that I'm working with are asking for flexibility in when they're teaching courses, or flexibility in faculty meetings and so forth, in order to be able to accommodate having to take care of parents that are locally living by. And so that's the other piece of taking that into account. Universities and colleges can provide financial support for childcare during conferences, and if possible, for research activities. Grant funding institutions are increasingly trying to re-examine how they can make provisions so monies can be utilized for childcare, because the cost of childcare, it becomes part of the grant application as an effort to sort of be able to do the work. And so it becomes one of those, just like you have to pay for a teaching assistant or an assistant in lab work, how does childcare also become part of that sort of larger budget that you're looking at? Faculty meetings are held during school hours, and flexibility and trust are the driving principles for when family issues arise and faculty need some latitude to make accommodating work decisions. Tenure and promotion, again, don't include penalties for taking any kind of familial leave, and collegial arrangements are done with regard to teaching and service expectations. Again, work schedules that are flexible, that also allows for the ability to do part-time work, or to be able to share a position with someone else, so that each of you are working part-time and yet getting the full benefits of that particular position. Establishing an on-campus childcare center, or working with local childcare providers in order to offer affordable, reliable, and safe childcare. And lastly, when research institutions can see the big picture and the long road ahead, meaning they make an investment in faculty who in return often are compelled to be invested in the research institution itself, these institutions then are open to utilizing the protocols in place that offer more time and flexibility to mom scholars, particularly so that they have the breathing room to complete their research, and also emphasizing quality versus quantity, because ultimately it's that impact of those research that makes a big difference, that over time parent scholars can produce a deep and rich body of scholarship that will make the interventions and provide insights in the long haul. This perhaps is the toughest for universities and colleges and institutions to acknowledge, because it means tenure and promotion requirements, for instance, need to be slightly recalibrated to take into account the impact of motherhood on scholarly production. And although father scholars are not always excluded from this equation, they oftentimes have home-based supports necessary to retain long hours at the lab, office, or in the field, and therefore are sometimes able to produce more work and research in lesser amount of time than mother scholars. And so really sort of being cognizant and taking that into account and not seeing that as a deficit, because it becomes an important way of recalibrating and rethinking the institution and really adopting a more culture of care perspective. So there's still much work to do in order to create these equitable policies, and I don't know how many of these particular best practices have been adopted or can be adopted in institutions here in Brazil, for instance. I know at our university, we've been trying very hard to adopt as many of these as possible, and I've been talking to different institutions across the US about how these practices really do make a positive impact in the overall scholarly production and the ability for particularly mama scholars to stay and create the work that they have worked so hard to be able to do in these institutions. The other thing is that we have to still self-advocate and press on the global working mother movement that includes principles and these counter stories and counter narratives that challenge antiquated narratives that mothers in academia have no place at the scholars' table and in the workforce overall. Therefore, in addition to advocacy efforts to persistently challenge social, cultural, and political economic structures that leave or can leave mom scholars out, we need to also continue to be creative and collaborative, not only with other mother scholars, but other people that we're working with together at our institutions in order to really create the culture of care within an academic spectrum around the globe as well, within our institutions and beyond. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with you all, and many blessings to you and your families. Obrigada.
Thank you so much, Mari. I'm really touched by your talk. It was really nice. A gente tem uns 10, 15 minutos para perguntas.
Hi. Let me grasp one particular point that you just touched, that is the englobing other sectors. Because usually when you have mothers, they will be teachers or professors or workers. But I think that's weakens the whole process, because you have to think in the academic life as a total thing. So how do you manage to do that, to put everybody in the same boat?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that part of it, in terms of the research that we've been conducting, particularly using testimonio, has been first to acknowledge the lived experiences of these different folks in these different positions. So the important thing is to first acknowledge, what does it mean to be a researcher in a lab, while also parenting is going to be very different than the anthropologist in the field and doing that kind of work. And so part of it is documenting what those experiences are like, and then seeing what are the similarities that cut across these various different lived experiences, and what are the differences that do exist that are different, that we have to sort of think about. Well, there's going to be a variety of different ways of addressing those differences in various different institutions. And so I think, first of all, the thing that has to happen is really trying to acknowledge that there are differences and similarities, and trying to think about how do we align ourselves in those similarities when possible, to be able to do that. Because you're right, everyone is experiencing different things. For instance, as a faculty member, I have much more flexibility in my work schedule than the secretary who's working in my office. She can't just pick up and go, whereas when my son was younger and they called me at school and said, you know, Professor Castañeda, your son is not feeling well, you need to come pick him up, I was able to just say, okay, I'm not teaching class right now, I was just in my office working, I'll pick him up and work at home. But my department manager doesn't have that same flexibility necessarily. However, as chair of the department, I also can make a decision about what kind of flexibility I want to be able to work with her. And so that's exactly actually what we've done in my department. So we have multiple staff members that have children, and one of them works once a week at home on Fridays, so that she is able to pick up her daughter after school rather than having to immediately send her to the child care center she does Monday through Thursday. And so how do we, in those, but I don't know, we don't know what we don't know, right? So those lived experiences become very important of documenting them, so that then we could see what are the contexts in which you're operating, and how can I work with you to be able to do, work with you so that that context can be productive for you and for the department, because she's still working in my department and she's doing a fabulous job, even though she's working from home on Fridays. And so that's just one example. Or someone that says, I need to leave. Okay, no worries, where are you going, what's going on? Okay, great, you know, and they'll say, you know, Mari, those 2 hours, I'll make them up in 2 weeks. Okay, I trust you. And that's the other piece, the principle of trust, that I find oftentimes missing in academic context, that in fact makes a big difference, and then people really then following through, and later on she will make up those 2 hours in some other way, I'm sure. But how do we get into these positions to be able to do that? I think that that's partly how we can start acknowledging that there are differences, but what are the places of similarities and connection that we can work with? Because I know what it means to be a mom and have a sick child, even though Omadeli, who is the person I was talking about, is not. But she is also a mother, and she knows what it means to have a sick child. So we can both make that connection, and I understand what that means. So I think that that's partly what you can do that. Gracias por tu pregunta.
I have a question about leadership. So there's another kind of bias that we didn't touch base during these 2 days that says, in kids, if you investigate kids and look a boy that tells everybody how to do things, he's a leader. On the other hand, if you have a girl that do the same stuff, she's bossy. And there are other things that this persists during lives, and there are other things that people say about women in leadership, that sometimes they are more emotional or unstable. And I would like to know your opinion about if there is a difference between leadership between men and women, And also if you perceive during your career this kind of bias. I believe it's a bias.
Again, also wonderful. We can spend a couple of days just talking about leadership, ¿verdad? So in terms of leadership, I think that yes, the perception that oftentimes is out there is that women and men lead differently. But my experience, and it's in some ways there's been a difference in my own sort of experience as a leader in my institution, where I do feel that because of my experiences, not just as a parent, but as a mother, as someone that's coming from California, and all these different positionalities that inform who we are, right? That there are very much of that sort of landscape. I feel like the way in which I can engage with people, I do tend to be much more empathetic. Certainly people come see me a lot more than the male chair departments. We talk about those differences where we'll have meetings together and all the chairs talk about what the experience is like, and the group is half men, half women. And a majority of the women will say, wow, many people come and see me and they're sharing, they're just, FYI, I'm just letting you know I'm having a hard time right now. Whereas the men, they're like, wow, no one comes to see me and will just share that experience with me. And that is a heavier, in many ways, burden that women, I think, end up carrying, because you end up hearing a lot more from folks' emotional lives than oftentimes the men hear. At the same time, my colleagues that are the chairs of departments have said, I'm open to wanting to be supportive and be empathetic and hear people, but I'm perceived as someone who is unwilling or unable to do that. And so one of the conversations that we've been having is like, okay, so how do you share that with your faculty and your staff? Do you say, hey, anyone come see me, open door policy. I'm here open to hear that out. And that actually has shifted the number of people that are seeing now department chairs who are men. Because just saying that simply opening up, whereas women are perceived as just having an open door policy all the time, the men have to actually explicitly say that for people to come see them. And yes, I've experienced bias in my own experience as well, you know, as a faculty member, as a graduate student, you know, even as a chair of a department. You know, oftentimes I think then sort of my, you know, the perceptions of my ability to lead in our department. It's a very large department of 1,000 undergraduates. We have almost 30 faculty, so it's pretty huge. But the other thing that I feel that has, for me, been a very big source of strength is that I actually have a network of other mujeres that are professors, that are administrators, that are staff members, where we get together once a month to talk about our experiences and what's going on. And it's amazing how things that I hadn't thought about, someone shares, and I'm like, oh, that's a great idea. I should probably bring that to the way in which I'm doing X, Y, Z, you know, in my position. But I do feel that overall there has been a difference in the ways that that people perceive my ability to be a leader. And I think also women are increasingly sort of pushing back this notion of bossy and saying, well, now I'm a boss lady and I don't care. You know, like I'm going to adopt the boss lady thing. Yeah, you think I'm a boss? Well, too bad. Yeah, this is the way I'm going to do it. And I think that I've sort of adopted a little bit of that too, where people are like, Mari's really nice, but she's really tough. She's really nice, but she like, don't mess with her, you know, so kind of thing. And I'm like, yeah, you know, because I'm not here to play games. Like, I'm here to get the job done. I'm not here to be your best friend. I need to do a job. And so when people understand that, there is a sort of a different way in which the engagement is going to be with me. And that's also just my own way of being. Not everyone is necessarily has that same characteristic. And so I think people just have to bring in what their full selves are like, and how do you bring that into that leadership capacity that we all have, you know, to be able to do that. But I think that it's definitely an ongoing question. I feel that I don't have a lot of mentors that I can look to, like other women that are chairs of departments, deans, or presidents of universities, because that number is still so small. And I want to find other folks that are in those same leadership positions to learn from them, and to, you know, take what I like and leave the rest. You know, and also the other thing that for me is really important is progress, not perfection. Like, that's my motto, is progress, not perfection, because being perfect is impossible and it's not going to happen, but I want to make progress as a leader, and that ultimately is my marker of how I move forward with my own work.
Hi, it's not really a question, but how much do you think that this behavior linked to motherhood in academia is connected to the fact that we have a format of person in academia that we want to shape, right? Like everybody equal. And we know that people are indeed different, right? So do you think that this behavior that we have in academia is reflecting how we educate people or create new scientists? Do you think, it's now a question, do you think that, yeah, because I did my sandwich PhD outside Brazil, and then I saw exactly the same. Like, I expected to see in Europe different behavior. I think they are trying mostly to change. Like, we see a problem, we see people are depressed, or we see all those problems, and we want to do something. But we want to do something is not most of the time that they are indeed doing, right? Or doing, in fact, something. So it's mostly like you see that things that will change, but because I think empathy is not something that you can train someone to be, right? Like, or to have. And also sometimes you have empathy, or people mix empathy with emotional, right? And also sometimes to be emotional is to be weak. And I don't agree. I'm particularly really emotional, but I'm not weak, and I know that. And sometimes many men, they want to convince me that I'm weak because I'm emotional, but I know that be emotional make me something different sometimes, right? So a bit of your opinion in that. Thanks.
Yeah, I think also a great question. I think that in terms of how do we disrupt those spaces and how do we do something different, I mean, I think also just acknowledging that, you know, universities originally were not developed with us in mind. I mean, I think that that's just the first thing that we have to sort of recognize, is that research institutions, universities, colleges, didn't necessarily have women in mind as not only students, but also as faculty and administrators. So that's in terms of its historical foundation, it's already operating in a very, very different kind of way. That doesn't mean that that history has to continue and that's the only way in which it could operate. So I think that in terms of how then we disrupt that historical context and sort of becoming the legacy that here on out lives forever, part of it has to do with the ways in which we engage with each other in these spaces. But also the other thing that I really enjoyed from yesterday and today, for instance, I love seeing the pictures of the presenters showing their children and showing pictures of them in the lab and showing pictures of how do they bring the children into these and families into these spaces that disrupts, again, this is the way in which I'm going to be the professor. This is the way that I'm going to be the researcher. We can't always bring children to labs all the time because, you know, there's issues with, you know, safety issues and so on and so forth, of course, you know. But I mean, in terms in general, how do we bring children into conferences, for instance? So that's one of the things that actually we're seeing a lot more in the United States. I love seeing the kids here as well. Like, I feel like that starts disrupting those spaces and starts reimagining what it means to be a professor. What does it mean to be a scholar and a researcher? We ourselves start reimagining that for ourselves, and in many ways challenge and push people to have to reimagine it as well, because I'm not going to run out because the baby is crying. I'm going to stay. Actually, that happened the other day. Last week, the mayor of San Juan of Puerto Rico was visiting Massachusetts, and she was giving this big lecture about what happened with Hurricane Maria and the impact that had on the island and so forth. And there were several moms there with had children, and they start crying, and they all start sort of getting up to leave. And she's like, no, quédense aquí. Ustedes tienen que estar participando en este evento. Like, and the kids need to be here too. And so people, I mean, they were just immediately, and she's like, no, why do we feel like we cannot be here with our children? We're going to disrupt what this public, you know, elegant event is supposed to be about. And sure enough, eventually the kids settled down and they were fine. And the moms got to stay. And so having someone just point it out because they were leaving, because other people were turning around looking at them like, when are you going to get that kid out of here? You know, they were just sort of turning around like, and so they felt the pressure. But she called it out and said, no, you all need to stay and participate. So I think part of it is how do we also self-advocate that and change that ourselves? And also deal with the fact that there's going to be what we call blowback, right? There's going to be sometimes people that disagree and may not like it. I would bring my son to class sometimes because it was snowing, school was canceled, and I didn't have childcare, so I needed to bring him to the classroom with me. And those experiences for him, he said, had been the most impactful, but they were impactful for my students, and particularly for my women students who later on said, Mari, that was amazing just to see him there, sitting. He wasn't doing very much. He was just coloring and doing whatever. Every so often he would raise his hand and say, Mommy, can I ask a question too? You know? I'm like, okay, mijo, go ahead. You know? But for them, that was very impactful because they were like, I just thought, first of all, that professors just didn't have kids. Like, I thought you had no life, that you lived here. Like, they literally thought that somehow I lived at the university and didn't have a life and didn't have this whole other life of myself. And that, again, started disrupting for themselves what it meant to be a professor, what it meant to be a scholar in front of that classroom with them, that really challenged their own notions. And I still keep in touch with many of these students who are now also trying to figure out how do I do this juggle in this professional career, and their careers are not necessarily academia, but the professional careers that they're embodying. And so I think that that's part of it. And I think that it's still a long road ahead, right? It's not something that happens overnight, and it's not something that we change immediately. But I think making that conscious, bearing witness in those moments, I think becomes really important. Bearing witness for ourselves, but for other people as well, I think becomes the other piece of it too. Like that mayor who was bearing witness for those moms in that space as well.
Hi, I don't really have a question. I just want to thank you for being brave and for being a woman, for being Latina, for being everything that you are. And I mean, we don't have to put up a fight against men or against manhood. We just have to do small things just like you're doing right now. And I think they'll eventually become something bigger like you're doing. And I'm not really comfortable because we have been speaking about being girly and about being small and less than men about our whole lives. And when we become something bigger, we feel guilty. So thank you for bringing it.
Obrigada, thank you. Gracias. And I mean, again, like, I feel like I'm going to cry. De veras, no, gracias por tu comentario. I really do appreciate that because I think that, you know, that it's important to speak out and speak up and to be brave in these spaces here, but in other places. And I also want to note that I also don't do it by myself. I feel like I have a whole, that's why I mentioned like my ancestors, but also family and community, which makes a big difference in my ability to stand on their shoulders. And I think also having the help of a very supportive husband as well makes a big difference too, but not the only one. You know, he's sometimes like, I'm trying to catch up to you, you know, so in his own sort of career and so forth. He always says, you know, I look up to you, and it's amazing to hear a man say that, you know, as well. But thank you so much. I really appreciate that comment. Gracias.
Mari, thank you so much. It was just a great talk. Alguns avisos, vamos tentar chegar 1h30, começar 1h30, tá? Porque realmente a gente está preso de tarde, vários dos palestrantes vão ter que sair, então a gente vai ter que acabar. Eu espero não precisar cortar discussões, mas a gente vai ter que encurtá-las pelo menos. Tá? Obrigada, gente.
Gracias a todas y a todos.